In this lesson, we'll be discussing feather effects. If you'd like to follow along, go under your File menu to Open, and in the Working Files folder, go into Chapter number 14 and select Working with Feather Effects and just click Open. We're going to start with an effect called Basic Feather. But before we do that, I want to select this object and zoom in to the width of the top of my page. Now, with that object still selected with my selection tool, I'm going to apply an effect to the entire object. I have my object listing selected. To apply the effect, I'm going to go under the FX pop-up. FX always stands for effects, whether it's in InDesign or Illustrator, or even if you're writing a movie script. If you want to describe an effect, you would type FX: and describe the effect. Let me go down to Basic Feather. Why is it basic? Really because it was the first feather effect in InDesign. So being that it was first, it was basic. And with that object selected, I'm just going to hit Preview. And you can see that the outside edge of my object is actually feathering. That means it's going from opaque to transparent at the edge of the object. So if I wanted to increase that feathering, I would increase the feather width. So the feathering is going to go further and further into the object each time I click the up arrow. The next setting is called Choke. Choke is actually skewing the center of the change from opaque to transparent further in. So watch what happens if I click on the arrow to the right of the choke field and I use the scrubby slider to drag upwards. What it's doing is the most transparent part of the effect is moving further and further in until the change from transparent to opaque happens at exactly 0.3125 inches in this case, because that's the feather width. If I start dragging the scrubby slider further and further out, you'll see that the center of the change in the transparency is moving further and further out. In other effects, you're going to see a setting called Spread. It's exactly the same thing as Choke, only instead of going inward, it's going outward. You'll see that when we get to it. For corners, I have three choices. The default is called Diffused, which is kind of nondescript. You'll see what I mean when I go to Rounded, which is obviously very rounded in the corners. Another choice is Sharp. That goes sharply into the corner. I'm going to go back to Diffused. And let's talk about noise. Noise is texture. It adds grain. In this case, it's adding a bit of texture or grain to the feather effect. There's a problem with effects that are created on computers. They're too perfect. To make them a little less perfect and a little more natural, you can add just a little bit of noise. So if I add 5 or 6% noise, it's going to add just this little bit of texture. But watch what happens if I drag it all the way up to 100%. I kind of get a grunge effect. Well, let me go back down to just 5% and click OK. Now, I want to make it clear that this is not blending to white. It's blending to see-through. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to drag this object over towards the right and top margin and let go. And I'm also going to make the image narrower so it lines up with the left side of that red shape. And let me just scroll over a little bit. And you can see that it is blending out to transparent, not to white. Let me just zoom out to fit my page. I'm going to hit Command 0 on a Mac, Control 0 on a PC, and I'm going to click and drag these other objects after I select them with my selection tool over to that right margin. And also deselect them, select the second object, use Smart Guides to make it the same width as the red object. And now I'm going to zoom back in on just that second object. Go to my selection tool and select the object. Why don't we apply a different kind of feather effect to this second photo? I'm going to click down on FX and go to something called directional feather. In some ways, it is very similar to basic feather. The major difference is you have the opportunity to put a different feathering width on the top, bottom, left, and right. Let me click my up arrow a couple of times at the top. Also do the same thing at the bottom. And maybe on the left, I'll make it a lot more, so I'll click several times. And on the right, I'll click a few times as well. Let me just move my dialog window out of the way, and you can see it is vastly different in the width of the feathering to the left side. Some of the other choices, almost exactly the same as you would find in basic feather. There's noise, which I probably would want to apply about 5% or 6 or 7%, and also choke if I wanted to move all of these feathering widths further in. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to click OK, and we're going to take a look. Why don't we scroll down to the next object and select that. And once again, with the object listing selected in my effects panel, I'm going to go to my FX pop-up and go to Gradient Feather. And by default, what it's doing is it's starting on one edge of the picture on the left side and blending out across the entire width of the picture to 0% opacity on the right-hand side. But maybe that's not exactly what I want. Maybe I want the most opaque part of the picture further to the right. So what I'm going to do is click and drag the black stop in my gradient stops further to the right. And you can see now it's blending it out to transparent over a much shorter distance. I can also change the opacity as a unit. The entire object can be made more transparent. And you can see it's more see-through. I'm going to go back up to 100%. I can also, besides doing a linear gradient, which is what this is, it's a gradient that goes from opaque to transparent instead of between two colors. So it's a different way of using a gradient in a feature. But for the linear type, we're already seeing that. Why don't we look at radial? And you can see that it is a radial gradient that's controlling the opacity of this particular image at this point. Let me go back to linear. And I can also change the angle. Let me just show you. If I go to the angle section and just click and drag, you can see I'm changing the angle of that blend from opaque to transparent. If I go down towards the bottom at 90%, let me just type 90 in here and click off of it. And you can see it's straight up and down. It's blending off from 100% opaque to 100% transparent over the distance that I'm setting up. Now, I got to tell you, I very rarely come into this dialog window. There's actually a better way to apply a gradient feather. I'm going to hit cancel. And with the object still selected, I'm going to hit Shift G, which brings me to the gradient feather tool. And you can see it's right underneath the gradient swatch tool. And it works exactly the same way. If I wanted to blend my motorcycle image out to transparent from a particular place in this image at a certain angle, all I have to do is click and drag over my selected object with my gradient feather tool and let go. I'm picking a starting point for my gradient feather wherever I click first. I'm selecting an angle by dragging at a certain angle, and wherever I let go, it's going to fade out to totally transparent. Let me deselect this, and I'm going to go into preview by hitting my W key on my keyboard. And you can see it looks as if this object is blending out into the background. And if I'm not happy with it, I could always reselect the object, go back to my gradient feather tool, and click and drag. And you can see smart guides are helping me to keep my gradient feather straight up and down. So you can see that changed slightly. So, great feature. In upcoming lessons, we're going to continue discussing effects and transparency.